So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
So we've made it to the NFL Draft. The 2022 NFL Draft is upon us. Free agency is over, re-signings are over, new coaches have been signed, and the coaching staff is established, and we are back. We are into the 2022 NFL Draft. Going into this draft, post-free agency, my biggest targets going into this were the edge rushers, the linebackers, the wide receivers, and the defensive line. And if there's good value, possibly target a quarterback and a depth running back to put behind DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams for the future. So the second overall pick came around. Evan Neal was the first overall pick. The offensive tackle from Alabama was the first selection by the Jacksonville Jaguars. And obviously at this point, the big argument and the big decision was whether to take Kayvon Thibodeaux or Aiden Hutchinson in this draft. I think they're both very different players, having very different styles and very different pros and cons and different styles of play, although they both play the same edge rusher / outside linebacker position in this Detroit Lions scheme. And when kind of comparing these two, I took into account, obviously health factors. I took into account motor. I took into account production in college. I took into account ceiling and floor and what each player did really well. And at the end of the day, I think Kayvon Thibodeaux is the better pick for the Detroit Lions. I think he's bigger, faster, and stronger than Aiden Hutchinson. He's more athletic, arguably the most athletic edge rusher we've seen in a very long time, if ever. He's 6'5", 250 pounds, had 19 sacks, 35 and a half tackles for loss, 7 passes defended, and 3 forced fumbles in just 20 collegiate games. He's versatile. He can play outside linebacker. He can play, edge rusher in a 3-4 or in a 4-3. He is very scheme versatile. He can play any position. And knowing that he would play outside linebacker for the Detroit Lions and that at some point he would be put in coverage like we've seen Charles Harris and Romeo Okwara and Trey Flowers have been doing over the past year or two, I would trust Kayvon Thibodeaux in coverage more than any of those guys, while still, obviously having him be a primary pass rusher, averaging almost 1 sack a game in almost 2 tackles for loss every single collegiate game he had. His production is off the charts. His measurables are off the charts. I'd be very curious to see what his combine results look like, because I would imagine his 40, his vert, and his change of direction are going to be amazing for an edge rusher. Kayvon Thibodeaux has the highest ceiling in the class. Yes, he might not have as high as a floor as Aiden Hutchinson, but Kayvon Thibodeaux is the best player in the class, in my opinion. He is the highest ceiling, and I think with Dan Campbell, you can kind of iron out his motor issues, because that's really the only thing that's being held against Kayvon Thibodeaux, is some of the time his motor isn't as high as Aiden Hutchinson's. But I think if anybody can fix that, it's going to be Dan Campbell. If anybody's going to get Kayvon Thibodeaux to play his heart out and to play the hardest that he could, it's going to be Penei Sewell, his former teammate, that's going to push him every single day at practice. And it's going to be Dan Campbell, who is going to obviously, once again next year, push this idea and this ideology that you're going to work your butt off, or you're not going to play. And I don't care if you're the number 2 overall pick, and I don't care if you're the number 256th overall pick. You have to earn your spot on this roster, and I think Kayvon Thibodeaux is going to buy in. I think that he is more than capable of buying into that system. I think part of his motor problems in college were, obviously partially business decisions, knowing he's going to go highly in the NFL draft, not wanting to severely injure himself at any point in the college football season. And yes, he has a few injury concerns. He's missed time over the past 2 years with small, minute injuries, but they haven't been anything career threatening. They haven't been anything that have kept him out long term. It's been, like elbow sprains or like an ankle sprain or something. It's been something to keep him out a week or two, but not anything to keep him out long term. So really, I think his big flaws as a prospect, I think his big cons as a player can be ironed out in the NFL. And I think the ceiling at this point at number 2 is simply just too much to pass on if you are the Detroit Lions. So Kayvon Thibodeaux is the pick at number 2. All right, now with the number 2 pick out of the way, and Kayvon Thibodeaux officially being a member of the Detroit Lions to pair with Romeo Okwara, you go down to the 30th overall pick, the pick that we received for trading away Matthew Stafford. It is one of the Rams' 2 first-round picks that we got in the Matthew Stafford-Jared Goff trade, and with the 30th overall pick, it was a very strange situation because linebacker position, just based on how the board fell, wasn't all that well. Nakobe Dean went top 15. There was a couple of guys that you could maybe make an argument for, but the board just didn't fall very favorably for what the Detroit Lions needed in the draft after this free agency. But there was one player that I thought could potentially be a future wide receiver for the Detroit Lions, a guy that produced really well in college, produced really well at a Power 5 school, a guy that didn't have great quarterback play throughout his time in college, but still produced some really, really good numbers, and that was wide receiver David Bell from Purdue. He was the best player and the best fit for the Detroit Lions at the time. He's a good athlete and he's a really good wide receiver with good hands, runs great routes, and was a consensus All-American in the 2021 season. I think it may be a little bit early for a wide receiver, but that's just kind of the way the board fell. And I know Brad Holmes isn't likely going to take a wide receiver early, but just based on the board, I would like to think that if the board fell the way it did in this mock draft, that Brad Holmes would take the best player available. And at the time, the best player available was David Bell. David Bell, he's 6'2", 205-pound wide receiver out of Purdue. In his 4 years at Purdue, he totaled 232 receptions for 2,946 yards and 21 touchdowns in 29 games. Really, he did that in the final 3 seasons as he did not play much as a freshman. So he averaged just about 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns a year in the Big Ten. Again, he runs really good routes, has really good hands, and I think could be the future wide receiver for this team. And yes, I do think it's a little bit early. Yes, I do think taking a wide receiver this early is likely something Brad Holmes wasn't trying to do when he began this, 2022 draft. But David Bell was in my opinion, top 5 wide receiver in this class. I think he's my number 5 or 6 wide receiver on the board right now. And getting him at 30 is really good value based off how the board fell. This was one of the picks that I'm still a little bit indifferent about because I like the prospect and I like the player. I'm just not entirely sure if this is the best use of the 30th overall pick. I'd say there are maybe better picks out there, and I would think that if the board fell any other way, there could be other picks, or you could even potentially trade up from this pick to obviously get somebody else. Not that I think David Bell is bad. I think he can be a really good prospect for the Lions, but I just think that, this is when I'm just a little indifferent because I really like the prospect. I'm just not sure about the fit early in Detroit. I think long term it could be a really good pairing with, maybe an Allen Robinson. It could be a really good pairing with somebody else that we might take in this draft class and somebody else that we were targeting. But I just think that, the Lions need to upgrade their wide receiver position, right? Without them, it's Allen Robinson, it's Josh Reynolds, who I don't think is a long-term solution. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown and Quintez Cephas. And that's really your 4 wide receivers after this year if the re-signings go the way that I projected them to go. So I think you do need a 5th wide receiver. I think that wide receiver is a position of need still for the Lions. And I think David Bell is more than capable and more than valuable at this 30th overall pick to warrant taking him. Now, the Lions didn't have to wait long to get onto their 34th overall pick, their 3rd pick in the NFL draft. And with this 3rd overall pick, again, kind of similar, just how the board fell, Malik Willis was sitting there with the 34th overall selection. And Malik Willis has been one of my biggest draft crushes the entire season. He's 6'1", 215 pounds. In the past 2 years at Liberty, he's passed for 5,107 yards, 47 touchdowns, and 18 interceptions in just 23 games. He's a phenomenal athlete. He's super mobile. He has an elite arm. He has a phenomenal release. He has all the physical tools to be an MVP caliber quarterback in the NFL. Now, he does have some decision-making issues. He does have a tendency to play hero ball at times, meaning like instead of just taking a check down, he wants to extend plays and get the big play down the field, which sometimes helps him and sometimes really hurts him. I think he is smart enough and he can read the field fairly well. He's not a phenomenal like IQ player necessarily, not to say he's dumb obviously, but I think he wasn't asked to read the field very well at Liberty. It was kind of a 1-2 read offense that kind of played to his athletic ability and kind of played to his strengths. I think that can be ironed out in the NFL. I think honestly, truthfully, with all the athletic upside, with all the potential, and with the high enough ceiling that Malik Willis has, I think you can very much warrant taking him with a second round pick. I think a first round quarterback really isn't likely in this draft for the Detroit Lions, but if Malik Willis does fall to the second round, a guy that at one point in the season was talked about as going as the number one player in this class, being the number one overall pick in the 2022 draft class, if he falls to you at 34 with all that upside and all that potential, I truly think that he would be a good quarterback for the Lions. I truly think that Mark Brunell and Dan Campbell and Joe Brady especially can really work their magic with Malik Willis. I think Malik Willis would be the most talented quarterback that Joe Brady would ever coach with and would ever have under his wing. And we saw what he did with Joe Burrow. Now imagine Joe Burrow with a little bit of a better arm and a lot faster and more athletic. That's what you're talking about with Malik Willis. And they're very different quarterbacks. That's not my comparison for Malik Willis is Joe Burrow. I'm just saying, we saw what Joe Brady did with Joe Burrow. I can only imagine what he could do with Malik Willis and David Bell and TJ Hawkinson and Allen Robinson and DeAndre Swift. That offense, especially if Malik Willis develops properly, is going to be a very hard offense to stop and is definitely going to be a big play offense for the Detroit Lions. Waiting a little bit longer, going to the 66th overall pick in this draft, there was one player that really stood out to me on the defensive line. I think defensive line is still something that Brad Holmes is going to look to address this year as the Detroit Lions general manager. I don't think the Detroit Lions got enough pressures last year. They definitely did not get enough sacks, and I don't think they stuffed the run in the way that they wanted to last year. So they started off this draft with an edge rusher to work on the pressures and the sacks, and I think this pick in the middle of the third round, they go back to defensive line yet again, and they pick up somebody that can help them stop the run and also help them get pressure in the interior. And with that being the case, the Detroit Lions, with the 66th overall pick in this year's NFL draft, select Phidarian Mathis, defensive tackle from Alabama. Now, Phidarian Mathis is a 6'4", 312-pound nose tackle from the Alabama Crimson Tide. He's played both defensive tackle and edge rusher for the Tide, meaning he's a very versatile player. He's a really good athlete for somebody of his size. Last year alone was really the first time he got a starting role, and in his starting role, he had 49 tackles as a nose tackle, 10 tackles for loss, 9 sacks, 2 passes defended, a forced fumble, and 2 fumble recoveries. He's a very good athlete. He's really slippery when it comes to getting around guards and centers. I mean, he has a really good set of moves. He's not super powerful. He's not going to rush people into the backfield in a way like a Lee McNeil might, but he's super slippery, has really good hand usage, has been taught very well by the Alabama coaching staff, and he is a player that just overall seems to get pressures, finds a way to get in the backfield, and finds a way to make plays. He's not quite as dominant as some of the former Bama defensive linemen, but he's still really good, and he can be a really productive interior rotational pass rusher or run stopper for the Detroit Lions. He can kind of fit both roles. He's good at run stopping. He is good at pressuring the quarterback as well. I think he can help the Lions improve in both aspects of the game from the defensive line perspective. And with the 66th overall pick, he was one of the players that I was really targeting with a middle round pick. Now with the 98th overall pick, going down to the 5th pick of this this mock draft for the Detroit Lions, there was one player that stuck out to me. He had so much upside, he had so much potential, and even coming off an injury-riddled season, I think he has some of the highest potential at wide receiver in this draft. And yes, I'm going to address wide receiver once again, and I know there's going to be a lot of people likely upset with this pick, but I think George Pickens at the 98 overall spot is probably the best value pickup in this draft, because before the 2021 college football season, George Pickens was looked at as a surefire, bona fide first-round pick and arguably the best wide receiver in college football, over Chris Olave, over Garrett Wilson, over David Bell, over the wide receiver from Alabama, whose name is currently slipping my mind. He was looked at as better than all of those players. And then in spring training, he tore his ACL in a spring game or in a spring practice and did not play a lot of the 2021 season. He is a player that has slowly been coming back for the Georgia Bulldogs, and really in the past 2 to 3 games, more so the SEC championship and the first round of playoffs, he's a guy that has been getting more and more playing time, and he's a guy that, even not being 100%, is somebody that when they need a big play, they go to George Pickens. They go to number 1 in the Georgia Bulldogs uniform when they need a big play to be made, and even not being 100%, he looks pretty good. I mean, he got open versus Alabama, made a couple big catches. He got open versus Michigan and got a couple good catches, especially a really tightly contested ball on third down to kind of not win the game, obviously, for the Bulldogs in that semifinal game, but to extend a drive and to continue that momentum in the second quarter. They would then go down to score a touchdown later in that drive, and a large part of it was the third down pickup in tight coverage by George Pickens. He's a guy 6'3", 200 pounds, 89 receptions, 1,295 yards, and 14 touchdowns in 23 games. He has great hands. He's a phenomenal jump ball wide receiver, and he's a really good and willing blocker down the field for the Georgia Bulldogs. For a team that liked to run the ball a lot, especially early in his career as a Bulldog, he is somebody that is not afraid to block. He is somebody that is not afraid to be physical at the line. There was obviously the clip of him leveling Daxton Hill in the playoff game, not even being 100% at that point. The only real downside to George Pickens is obviously the injury concern. Can he get back to 100%? I think he's well on his way to getting back to 100% based off what I've seen this year late in the college football season. And then the other thing is he is a little bit limited in the routes that he can run. He's not going to be a guy that's ever going to be looked at as a top 10, top 15, top 32 route runner in the NFL, but he's a guy that doesn't need to be. You know, Calvin Johnson didn't run great routes. Randy Moss didn't run great routes. You know, Demaryius Thomas didn't run great routes, but all three of them are either Hall of Fame or borderline Hall of Fame kind of wide receivers, and it's because they're good at one thing. DK Metcalf runs, I think, 3 to 4 routes. Megatron Johnson, one of the greatest and most dominant wide receivers of all time, 80% of the routes he ran in his career were either fades, goes, posts, or screen. Those were the 4 routes that he ran the most, and everybody knew it was coming. They just could not stop Calvin Johnson because he was truly that dominant. And George Pickens is not Calvin Johnson, but he's certainly in the realm of DK Metcalf. He's certainly in the realm of even a Demaryius Thomas. So, I mean, you get that kind of production, you get that kind of a talent with the 98th overall spot. You get a guy that would not be there if it weren't for injury, but a guy that nonetheless, especially after I think the combine and once he shows he's 100% healthy, is going to be very much draftable within the top 100. Not as the number 1 receiver, not as the number 2 receiver in this class, but certainly as a top 100 pick and as a top 100 talent. He, I think, has the highest upside of this entire draft class, and I think has the possibility to be the best value in this entire draft class. And this is more of the range where Brad Holmes is looking to get his wide receiver of the future. You come out of this draft with David Bell and George Pickens to pair with Josh Reynolds, Allen Robinson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's a really deep, really young wide receiver core that can help out a guy like Malik Willis when he develops and grows into the starting quarterback that we all know that he can be. Now, there's 3 picks left in this NFL draft, and I'm going to go over them just a little bit quicker because at this point, the draft was kind of over. We didn't pick again until 181, almost 100 spots after George Pickens, and then you don't pick again until 218 and 231. So that's a long wait, and at this point, we're really in the 6th, late 5th, 6th round, 7th round pick of the NFL draft, and there's not a lot of talent left in this draft, or at least not a lot of well-known talent in this draft, but there were still a couple of guys that were on the board that could compete for a roster spot, and if not, push those borderline, those bubble players for a roster spot. The first of which at pick 181 is Jesse Luketa, the linebacker from Penn State. He's 6'3", 251 pounds, and in his career, he totaled 151 tackles, 11 tackles for loss, an interception, 6 passes defended, and a fumble recovery. He's got good size, good physicality, good speed. He's a great athlete like most Penn State linebackers are, but like a lot of Penn State linebackers, he is incredibly raw. He's a little bit inexperienced, isn't super fluid in any aspect of the game in particular, but fast enough and athletic enough to, I think, he could fit into this Detroit Lions defense and at the very least push Anthony Pittman for a roster spot. And if he doesn't make it, he's a practice squad guy. If he does make it, he pushes everybody else to get better on the roster. It's a very, again, low risk, high reward. But again, in a Brad Holmes kind of draft, you take the best athlete available and you know that your coaches can iron out his flaws. And I think that's another pick that Brad Holmes would very much be willing to make. Now you wait till 218 for the second to last pick. And at this pick, JT Woods, the safety from Baylor, was a guy that really stuck out to me. He's a guy that is 6'2", 193 pounds in that Baylor secondary. Baylor obviously being one of the best defenses in the country this year in college football. In the last 2 years as a starting safety, in the 2 years that he got time as a starting safety, he hit 103 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 8 interceptions, including one that he took back for a pick 6. And he did that in just 2 years as a starter. So in his 2 years at Baylor, where he got quality starting time, he averaged about 50 tackles a year and 4 interceptions a year. He is a long, rangy safety. He's a guy with good speed, good range. He's a long, lanky player at 6'2", but the only downside, he's not very physical. He's not very good in run defense. He's not bad at tackling wide receivers in the open field, but when it comes to like more of a power back, more of a power system, right, like a Derrick Henry, like a Jonathan Taylor, you would say, he's really not physical enough to step up in support in the run game in a way like Tracy Walker does, in a way like Jabril Peppers would, in a way like a lot of other safeties or linebackers should. He's not the most physical. He's not going to be the biggest run defender, but he's a guy that could step in at the safety position if there is injury. He's a guy that, you know, as that deep free safety, ball hawking guy, he sits back there, he reads the field, he makes plays based off of his instincts, kind of as a backup for Tracy Walker, a very similar player to Tracy Walker coming out of college, kind of long, lanky, had some good production at a Power 5 school, or had a really good production, a school where, you know, maybe you weren't the most recognized, but still had production and still have the talent to be a really good NFL player. And who knows, maybe eventually he is the successor to Tracy Walker in this defense. I do see a role for him in that vein for the Detroit Lions. And then with the 231st pick, there was nobody on the board. There was, no recognizable name at this point in the draft. But at this point in the draft, I wanted to take a player that was, really gonna be kind of more of a power back, somebody that isn't gonna be a receiving back, somebody that can get a lot of carries, somebody that can get a bulk of the carries, and somebody that last year showed that he can be the workhorse and the bell cow for an offense in the Detroit Lions system. And that is why I wanted to keep the Michigan kid at home in the 7th round and pick up Hassan Haskins, the running back, from Michigan. Hassan Haskins set a school record for touchdowns in a season last year for Michigan. He is not the biggest body, he's not the fastest player on the field, but overall, he has a really good yards per carry. He always falls forward. He always seems to find the right gap to get out and to get off and break off some really big runs for the Michigan Wolverines. He's a guy that you would keep him at home, you'd keep him in Michigan, and again, he can kind of be a guy that maybe doesn't beat out DeAndre Swift, maybe doesn't beat out Jamal Williams, and maybe even doesn't beat out Craig Reynolds next year for the RB3, but you can bet he's certainly going to push Jermar Jefferson. He's certainly going to push some other undrafted rookie free agent running backs for this roster spot, and I wouldn't be surprised if he beats out Jermar Jefferson, and I wouldn't be surprised even if they keep Jermar Jefferson as a 5th running back going into the preseason, and they let those two just battle it out for the last running back position, with the loser obviously going on to injury or going on to the practice squad and continuing to grow and develop as a player. This is a guy that was probably the best player available with the last overall pick. He fell a little bit in the draft. I'm not sure why he fell a little bit in the draft, but just going through the mock, it seemed like nobody wanted Hassan Haskins. So at the last pick in my draft, I decided, you know what, there is not going to be better value than Haskins. He probably won't be there in real life, but if he does fall to 231, I'd be more than happy to take him, keep him in Michigan, and see how well he can push players for a starting spot in this NFL, and how well he can push these players to become better and push them for roster spots in the Lions organization. Now, I don't have a full undrafted free agent class, but I think there are a couple of guys that we could look to target in this draft class, or could look to target in this undrafted free agent class. The first of which is Chase Allen, the 6'7" tight end out of Iowa State. Big body, really good red zone tight end. Could possibly push Brock Wright for that third tight end spot in the red zone. Just somebody that could be a camp body, but also has high upside. You look at Fallon Hicks, the DB from Nebraska, a guy that, played really well for the Cornhuskers over the last couple of years. Isn't super big, only like 5'10", but is kind of a scrappy nickel defensive back that maybe could add some depth to the secondary. And then Zach Van Valkenburg, the edge out of Iowa, had 15 tackles for loss in this last season. Probably isn't going to go very highly in the NFL draft, but if you're looking to add up somebody that can be a really good run defender and add up some bulk on that defensive line, I think he's another player that you can really target as a priority undrafted free agent. So kind of recapping the draft just a little bit before we get into final tweaks and before we get into final depth charts going into the 2022 training camp and preseason. The Lions get their edge 1, their QB of the future, their possible wide receivers 1 and 2. They get D-line depth with the Fedarian Mathis, and obviously if you go with the undrafted Zach Van Valkenburg, you bulk up your defensive line a lot, especially in the run support. You get your safety and your linebacker depth in this draft, and you get a really good complementary running back in Hassan Haskins that could very well push for some carries and could even push out Craig Reynolds for a spot as that rotational third running back that is going to pick up and fight for extra yardage each and every play. He seems to me like a Dan Campbell kind of a guy, Hassan Haskins does, and I think that he is a good fit for what the Detroit Lions want to get here and what they want to build in the Motor City. So with that being said, with free agency over, with coaching changes over, with the draft officially over, let's get on to the final depth charts going into the 2022 preseason and the 2022 training camp.